you can have a traumatic birth. Now, what does that mean? So let me define what a trauma is. We don't go by the incident, so it's not really about the birth, it's not about what happened, but it's about your perception of what happened. So if I perceive something to be a threat, say the baby came out and wasn't breathing, and then I went into like and stopped breathing, right? And so if I then remained in that place for an extended period of time and then had to switch on something that helped me to cope, that
Yeah.
is essentially what a traumatic experience is.
Okay, thank you so much for joining me on Ladies Talk. As I told you earlier on, this is something I've been very passionate about, and I am so grateful that you've taken the time out today to join me for this discussion.
I'm happy to be here, Rita. It's a pleasure. Thank you for the invitation.
Wonderful. Okay, so just before we started all of this, I was talking to you about the journey into motherhood, and if there is something that struck me the most is, there's this joy of becoming a mother. But then no one actually talks about the emotional and the sacrifice. I wouldn't call it the baggage that comes with motherhood. And that's where we're starting our discussion today, because you being a trauma expert, we're going to delve deeply into this, how it affects you as a woman, as a
Yes.
mother, and your relationship with others. So I know this is a bit off the topic, but why don't we discuss this often?
Hmm. I think, when you're going through something, it's important. And I think the emphasis is there. But there's this thing that I think happens because very soon the pain is overcome by this new thing that is in your life. So you got to keep it moving. And then as you keep it moving, well, the next thing comes and then the next thing comes. So by the time your child is 2 years old, well, maybe you're dealing with a new thing. And then by the time they're 5, you're dealing with a new thing. So I think it's really the rapid pace that things are happening at, why there isn't like this group of people that are kind of like right here going, we must talk about postpartum. We
Mhm.
must talk about the traumas that are, encroached in the birth experience. We must talk about the womb and the ways of repairing the womb once that birthing experience happens. So once you go through it and then move, it's kind of hard to come back to it unless something rather fundamental has happened that shifted you, which now made it so important for you to kind of stay here and have a conversation about it. And then you can invite the other people who might have experienced it, and then they come in and you can have the conversation. But I think it's more often that we don't have time to open the conversation, the gates to the conversation. So I'm so happy that you're doing that because it's such an important thing to talk about.
And talking about that fundamental thing happening, I haven't spoken with a lot of women, but the few women I've met, uh, there is always something fundamental happening. I know that there's a rush of emotions going on, but very few people, I mean, if we're going by a percentage, you would say that about 50% go through traumatic experiences giving birth to a child. You ask, oh, how was giving birth like? We don't want
Yeah.
to talk about it.
Right, right. So we don't want to talk about the prolonged labor. We sometimes don't want to talk about the interactions with the professional staff or the clinicians that are taking care of you. We don't want to talk about, cesarean section as like a pretty traumatic experience, not only for you, but also for the baby, right? We don't want to talk about the emotional shifts that are waved in and let me say threaded into all the biochemical changes that are happening in the aftermath. We don't want to talk about things like, well, I didn't have my support system in place. We don't
Yeah.
want to talk about some of those fundamental things that are necessary to have a great birth experience. We tend to just want to shift past it really quickly. Oh, that was bad. But you know what? Let me just kind of keep it positive and keep it going.
Okay. I'm going to go deeper into that later on because a part of me is like, is it the culture, the society that makes us feel like talking about? I'm not going to go deeper into that, but I don't want there to be too many big words. But because you're an expert, I'm going to use this word there. So, what are some of the psychological changes that naturally happen after becoming a mother from people that you have met, experiences, and all of that?
Well, okay, let's start right at the beginning,
Okay.
right? Right at the beginning when sperm and egg are meeting each other, because there's this whole, well, typically, you can do it in a petri dish these days, but typically there's this unfolding that is happening, a creation experience. We call it the Big Bang when we talk about the universe, but really it is a Big Bang moment when that child, the egg and the sperm meet after this aggressive kind of tour. And now voila, the child is now, or conceived, right? The conception, the idea of the child is here. But when it is planned and when it is expected, and sometimes when it's unexpected, it's this beautiful experiencing of then dreaming. What does this child look like? What will their personality be? What will we do together as a family? So you begin to like plan almost like step by step what this new entrance into your life and your partner's life is going to be like. And so you get really excited about that. Now the growth begins, and of course your body begins to shift, the child's body begins to shift, and all of that is happening in unison. And your biochemistry is shifting, obviously, to prepare this womb in order to house this child in this place of safety, right? Now, there's a number of things that can happen during the pregnancy period that can make a mother feel unsafe. And as soon as that registers in her mind, it goes into her biochemistry, and then it goes into the child's biochemistry. So there's this transitioning piece that's happening constantly in waves when you're pregnant. Now, by the time you come to the place where you're like preparing to have that wonderful birth experience, some people prepare. And
I like the fact that we had to laugh at that.
a lot of people don't, right? And they don't prepare for meeting the practitioner that's not as good as they would want. They don't
Yeah.
prepare to ask for a different practitioner. They don't prepare for a traumatic birth. They don't prepare for the child to be in trouble. But they also don't prepare for things to go absolutely well, right?
Hmm.
And so it's a mindset thing that says if you plan for it to look bad, it's going to look bad.
Bad.
If you plan for it to look good, it's going to look good. But there's some work that you have to do in order to protect yourself so that that is the outcome, right? So it doesn't require you to just wish. It requires you to actually do a bit of research. It requires you to prepare. It requires you to be protective of yourself and your child so that if there's any distress that is happening, you're not going to sit with it. You're not going to take the pain. You're not going to tolerate it, but you are going to demand certain outcomes almost immediately. But almost no one, I can tell you, almost no one plans for that. Everybody just kind of perceives that life is happening to them rather
Happening.
than the other way around. I am happening to life. So then, okay, you get to the birth, and maybe there's a traumatic experience that you have. No one plans for that either, and how to actually overcome that. So we don't think about things like postpartum therapy. We don't think about baby therapy. We
Hmm.
don't think about any of those things that would help the child and the mother to bond in this beautiful way because both are emotionally regulated and in that place of balance. So the body begins to transition. Now the baby is out. The womb prepared, it created. And now, almost like that, it has to dry up and it has to be taken out,
Mm.
right?
Yeah.
There's a grieving process that happens that I think most of us don't even recognize. The child has now left the body, this cocoon, right? And we should all be celebrating the leaving of the body and entering into this new space. But instead, the body kind of goes through this biochemical shift that's
Yeah.
really about, I long for this child to be
And
here.
then looking at that picture there, you see the mother with the baby and everyone's happy, but the mother is going through a whole lot of emotions that she can't even understand what is going on.
Exactly, right? And if no one is there to actually support her in that process, then she can take a real dive. And so the diving, whether that's your physician monitoring your hormones, or whether it's needing certain hormones to be elevated at certain points and monitoring that, also watching your brain chemistry and your brain structuring is an important thing. So if no one's watching that, you can easily slip into postpartum depression without even knowing it until it gets to a really bad point.
Okay, sorry, I'm gonna bring this in there because when you mentioned postpartum depression, earlier on I mentioned that most people would say the childbirth experience gave me PTSD.
right?
Are they the same thing or does one lead to the other?
No, I think they're slightly different. Of course, intertwined, but slightly different. So you can have a traumatic birth. Now, what does that mean? So let me define what a trauma is. We don't go by the incident. So it's not really about the birth. It's not about what happened, but it's about your perception of what happened. So if I perceive something to be a threat, say the baby came out and wasn't breathing, and then I went into like, and stop breathing, right? And so if I then remained in that place for an extended period of time and then had to switch on something that helped me to cope, that
Yeah.
is essentially what a traumatic experience is. You perceived a threat, you then stepped into a coping mechanism, but now that coping mechanism is going to be held there for a sustained period of time. And then you don't need it anymore, but it's still there. So that's the trauma that we now have to address. What was it? Did the baby come out alive? Was it breathing? All of those things. Was it a cesarean section? Was it a surprise that you had to shift from one type of thing to another type
Okay,
of
yeah.
birth? So what was it that then made it so threatening to you? There is the awareness of that. And then once you have that, then you can treat it.
Are
Now,
most people aware of what exactly caused that trauma?
yes, they will be aware. Now, unless they're unconscious, of course, then maybe they'll be subliminally aware, but they won't be consciously aware. So if a woman, for example, she has the epidural, and so she might experience some of her limbs being sustained in kind of like that prison of what I call stuckness, and just kind of like they're in that paralysis kind of state, right? And of course, it puts the baby in that paralysis kind of state too. So even the shock of that can be traumatic, even though it's like a small thing. Just the needle going in can be traumatic. The sustained paralysis can be traumatic. And then you're not able to bond with your baby immediately. That can be traumatic. It doesn't matter what it is, as long as your system says this is unsafe and then elicits a response, then you have to deal with that particular issue. But then the other side of it is the biochemistry. And so the brain has shifted, the body has shifted, your hormones have shifted, and now baby is out. And sometimes that processing takes time to then come to where there's now stability, there's balance. And so because of that, now you have to treat the two a little bit different. One is biochemical and certainly can be a traumatic induced kind of postpartum, but one is more so my transition and how well can I transition with the resources around me.
Okay, I'm going to ask this. Can a previous life trauma resurface after becoming a mother?
Absolutely.
Oh,
Absolutely. We're triggered in all kinds of ways. And if, for example, genetically, you have some kind of memory that's written on your cells, perhaps it's conscious to you, perhaps it's even unconscious, but now the birth happens, and all of a sudden, you have a memory that maybe is not yours,
mm,
or you have a memory of something from the past that you have seen. Now it comes forward full force. So all we're going to have to do is just deal with that memory. And once we deal with that memory, then whatever it's associated with, whatever symptoms, will actually quite disappear.
okay. Now, talking about trauma and the preparation, there's a whole lot of discussion that we have been having so far. For the mother experiencing this trauma, post-trauma, and all of that, what are some of the signs that you see yourself going deeper and you say this person might actually need help?
That's an excellent question. So, number one, do you see a shift in your personality? Like you were this way yesterday, something happened, and then all of a sudden, I can't get out of bed, or I'm treating certain things in a very defensive way. I don't want to cooperate with certain things, or I'm just listless, tired all the time. Or in some cases, we can actually go to a postpartum psychosis where mothers and quite frankly, I guess anybody in the household that's with them, you'll observe that you are perceiving certain things that are either heightened, intensified, and so your perception is skewed and you begin to react a certain way.
Mm,
Or other people will notice that you're acting very different and sometimes paying attention to certain things that otherwise you wouldn't. But it's the fear and the fear that something bad is going to happen, and yet it doesn't quite make sense, but you're constantly on what this kind of hypervigilance kind of state, or in some cases you're listless and you don't care, right? Because you can't, you just don't have enough energy to do it. So you're going to watch for the shift in identity, then you're going to watch for the psychosis. You're going to watch for the ability to interact and bond with the child, which is sometimes very difficult during this period because you're really just focused on yourself, you're just trying to survive yourself. So how are you going to help this little guy, that's in front of you? And you're trying really hard, but somehow you can't pull yourself out of it in order to make the difference. And that's where, if you have the right support from a partner, from parents, from family, friends, this is what's going to make the difference, because you do need a bit of a reprieve. You need to feel supported and comforted, almost like somebody has given you a tight hug. And then once you have that tight hug, you're like, okay, I can do this. I can do this. So slowly your system begins to resurface and begins to balance in what we call in polyvagal theory, the ventral vagal system.
I like
And
what you meant. I like what you mentioned there of this shift in behavior, and I'm going to give you a very practical instance that happens to a lot of women. I think it somewhat happened to me, but let's take this scenario now where you have this fear that you might not be able to see your baby grow up. I think I've spoken with a lot of mothers. I'm just giving that scenario, and they feel that, and you see them getting really close, like, I don't want anyone else to hold my baby. What would you call that scenario?
I don't know if there's an actual name for it. Maybe there is, but I don't know if there is one. But I think that protective nature, that I'm the only one that can do this right. No, stay away because you might be a threat. Those are all, I think, a normal part of the process. I would say don't judge it, don't criticize it. I don't think that's necessary. But I think the question would be, okay, so when you say that out loud, no one else can take care of my baby. I must protect my baby. I may not see my baby grow up. Let's get to the root of that particular thing, because then when we get to the root of it, we can find a trauma and resolve that trauma. And then what you'll find is, as we resolve that, most people just kind of settle, they balance really nicely and they just kind of return to their same old wonderful place that they were before.
I
If
wonder.
they were in a wonderful place.
Okay, I wonder if in situations, because I've also had conversations with immigrant moms, because you mentioned having that support, and you leaving your home country, it's not your birth country, and you don't have that much support. How does it affect? I don't know if you look, we don't have the statistics correctly, but I've spoken with a lot of immigrant moms, and this is one of the issues that you're having. That support that you call for, they really don't have it.
Exactly. So can I tell you that the number, or let's say there are factors that influence a person's health and well-being, even during pregnancy, right? So, okay, let's say the hormones is about 30% of that. But then what if your support system and access to people who will be there in and out of the room or just around you for the first 3 months? Let's say you need that window. If those people make up 40% of the recovery process. So if those people are present, you are likely to kind of move through very quickly and then transition into, oh, I'm just caring for my baby.
Mhm.
If they're not present, that is a huge, huge empty space that, if it's not filled, will result in feeling isolated, will result in feeling powerless, overwhelmed, overworked, absolutely exhausted, right? And it is that, the isolation and the sense of powerlessness or loneliness in that space, that will then actually spiral some women into depression.
Now, that powerlessness and isolation, those are very big problems. Now, in one way, we have listed out the problems, situations. If someone were to try and move out of that stage, we're moving to the stage of recovery now. What are some
Yes.
of the processes to begin healing?
Yeah. I think the first thing is, go to your family physician. And if you don't have a good family physician, it's probably time to switch, right? But a good family physician after you've given birth is going to welcome you in, Not only are they going to take care of all those lovely shots that the baby has to take, but they're actually going to take care of you. So they should be doing an assessment of how's the body recovering and how's the mind recovering. And by the way, holistically, when you think about family and when you think about intergenerationally, who is present with you, how's everybody coping and how's everybody doing? How's your partner doing? So your family physician should be taking care of you in that regard. Now, if your family physician has not already told you trauma recovery should be part of your journey, then obviously they don't quite understand what the birth process can do, right? And so, myself as a psychotherapist, I would say part of your agenda or part of the planning that you should include postpartum is at least 3 psychotherapy visits, right? Because if there is no problem and if you're all good, then those 3 visits will just help you kind of talk out loud what the experience was like with somebody who's a complete stranger. You speaking out loud is going to give you information, feed it back to yourself in a way that then supports you. You can make certain decisions about what you want, right? And then 3 sessions, that's it. But if you need longer than that, then that psychotherapist can continue with you, right? And so I think those are some fundamental things. Now, here's the other thing. Most of us don't think about our nutrition. And so I think automatically we should then install a nutritionist in our lives, right? Especially after birth, or maybe even during birth and before birth or before pregnancy. But if you begin to focus on your nutritional, supplements, and if you begin to think about your intake on a daily basis, that could also, in a very positive way, influence the postpartum period and the ways in which your mental health is upheld or somewhat flattened.
Okay. So nutrition, these are two things that I haven't really talked about, nutrition and even a psychotherapist. And some people would say, why would I see a trauma recovery expert, a psychotherapist for giving birth? I feel like there's a stigma with it. Like it's supposed to be something joyful. So why should I see someone? If someone is thinking about that right now, what would you tell the person?
So I, as I defined the trauma for you, and what I said was it's the overwhelm of the autonomic nervous system. Now, what does the autonomic nervous system do? It is our operating system, right? It's our CPU. It links the brain and the 3 portions of the brain to then the spine. The spine goes into all of the major organs of the body. That's our autonomic nervous system. It's a series of networks of neurons, of all of these ganglions, we call them, from the spine that then links with the body. Everybody has had a moment in their lives where that system was overwhelmed, where it became depleted. That's how we define a trauma. So whether you think you are traumatized or not, you are. And so the important thing to think about, even before you conceive, is to resolve the trauma, because we know traumas genetically go forward. So your child will have your traumas if you don't actually heal your traumas. So I always say to people, just for the good of the child, won't you do it? I figure that will be the one thing that can convince anybody I'm going to take care of my
Definitely.
child. So there's that. Everybody on the planet has experienced an overwhelm of their nervous system at some point, right? And especially in the birthing period, that's going to happen, right? Whether it was a good birth or not, there's certainly things that are happening that we should take care of. So for the person who's saying to them, well, I don't have a trauma, or themselves, I don't have a trauma, then I say, well, yes, you do. You're probably just not aware of it. And part of the process that any individual on the planet needs to engage in is some psychotherapy to resolve whatever trauma it is that they've been moving through. Now, then when you have a child, what additional things have kind of piled themselves on top of that? And then do we want to make sure we resolve that so that the next birthing experience is wonderful, or that this birthing experience, then you recover really quickly from whatever it is that you might be experiencing? That's really the result of psychotherapy. Helps you to tell your story in a way that you understand, that you can learn from, and then eventually gets you to a place where you make decisions that are for your good. That's it.
Well, wonderfully put. Now, I didn't. Earlier on, I mentioned you're a psychotherapist, you're a trauma expert, and then there's something you call the becoming method. I don't know if this is it, but somehow in my head, I'm like, what is your mechanism for becoming a mother? What would you call
Yes. So
your
our
framework?
process, yes, our framework, well, the becoming method is a trauma-informed psychotherapeutic method. We call it a decolonized method because to colonize something is to take up territory, right? You come into a person's space, you take up some territory, make up your own rules, and people have to abide by it. So we've kind of decolonized in the sense that every person who comes to us, we expect them to have a unique experience and that we cannot use the same technique for everyone, right? So
Mhm.
people come in at different stages. So some will need to talk because they've never talked before. And as they speak, they learn about themselves. But then some actually need a mechanical intervention of some kind. That includes medication. It also includes what we call neurotherapy. So biofeedback, neurofeedback. We also can take maps of the brain so that we can monitor what your brain looks like before therapy and after therapy. And so those pieces are all there. So our particular method basically looks at all the psychotherapeutic methods that are out there. We work with that individual client. We isolate for that particular client which method is going to work for them in this session. Now, it might not be the same method the next session, or it might not be the same method the session after that. So we remain kind of open. But here's the thing that I think separates us a little bit. Our other framework that's embedded within the becoming method is called smashing the mirror.
Mm,
When I experience a trauma, if I shift my identity, it's more than likely that I'm going to shift into the identity of the person who caused me harm.
mm,
That's the mirror. So when we resolve a trauma, what we are doing is dissolving the mirror that you have adopted and been looking at for so long. And instead, we now bring you back. So that identity shift that happened when the trauma occurred, it's undone as you process. And then you come back to yourself and you're like, oh, you mean I was that person for so long? Because there's this thing that happens in our most traumatic experiences. It's that if I'm in a room, for example, with a doctor and I'm giving birth, and maybe it's a cesarean section, I didn't expect it, in fact, didn't want it, right? And sometimes it's even the choice and the taking of a choice that makes it traumatic, right? So in the aftermath, I'm looking at the physician, I'm looking at the nurse, I'm looking at the anesthesiologist who was in the room, I'm looking at whoever was in the room. And what I'm going to notice is that, oh, I've adopted their behavior
mhm.
towards me. And how about I give that up altogether? And we willingly do it once we recognize that's what we've been doing, but most people don't understand that's what they've been doing. So that's what we call smashing the mirror. Kind of underlines the becoming method, which is focuses then on truth telling.
Mm,
The first part of resolving any fear is to speak the truth about it. Once you speak the truth about it, you can then process it with a new level of awareness. So we call that a conscious awareness, but we must also forgive it. Now, we can look at that as a religious term, or we can look at it as a processing term that your cell has to process and let go, right? And that's all forgiveness is. It has to let go. But sometimes you have to see a picture that allows you to know you're holding on to something. So as we work with our clients, we show them, oh, you had this experience. This is what you've been holding on to. You've been holding on to a belief that no longer serves you. You've been holding on to behaviors that are actually harming you.
mm.
You've been holding on to ways of relating to people that's actually harming you and others as well. So all of these pieces that you have now taken on, would you like to release them and come back to
I
all
would
that?
like to. I feel like we're in session already. I would like to. And if there's one thing you want to say to a new mom, a mother right now going to trauma, what's that one thing that you would like to say to them?
You know what? The one thing I would like to say is if you can just go back and meet yourself for a second. So
Mm,
if you've had one of those traumatic births and here you are 2 years later or maybe a year later, and if you could go back for a second and just visualize with me, if you could walk back into that hospital room wherever it was that you were delivering, and see yourself in all the glory, your legs up and baby's out and all this other stuff. And go over not to the baby, but to you. And then just put your arms around you. And for a moment, just meet you and talk to you and explain to her, man, this was hard. That was a hard labor to go through. That was a hard operation to endure. I so understand why you're raging right now. I so understand why you're so upset right now. I so understand why you did everything that you did in this moment. But it's not about convincing her to release in that moment. It's just about holding her. And if you can go back and lay down with yourself, hold yourself, talk to yourself in this way that is loving and compassionate and kind, that is the best therapy you can give yourself. In fact, you can do it at home and like you would never need to see a psychotherapist. The only thing is most people don't do that for themselves.
No, we
But,
don't.
but once you can have compassion for yourself, that's where the healing begins. So that's the word I would use. Have compassion for you. And then find somebody who can have compassion while you speak about the most outrageous things that you have had happen in your life. That will be the best therapist ever.
All right. Thank you so much. This was a very wonderful discussion. I feel like we should go over and over and over again. But I believe there will be a part two because you mentioned identity shift, and a lot of women face that getting
Yes,
back to yourself.
yes,
So thank
yes.
you so much for this discussion.